Welcome to the Heen View, a podcast series which interviews a range of sports club representatives and identities during the COVID-19 shutdown. We find out what these clubs are doing during the health crisis, which has seen winter sports postponed. I'm Mark Heen, and today I'm joined by my co-host, Mark Stone. Welcome, Stoney.
Yeah, thanks, Heen. I'm pretty excited about today. It's in my world, the footy world, and a really special guest this afternoon, and should be some big insights in our special guest.
Just quickly, we've had a number of different guests, a football coach, a guy who works in mental wellbeing space, also netball coach that's pregnant, a professional netballer, an administrator. We're going to look at the recruiting world today, but just quickly, we've gone from a country environment into, a city environment as well. So it's amazing how many perspectives and different types of geography that we look at.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And to go the elite level, and you'll introduce the guest in a moment, to go to the elite level is a pretty special thing.
Okay, so today we are joined by a prominent AFL-based recruiter with the Sydney Swans. He joined the Sydney Swans in 2006 after stints with Adelaide Crows and the Brisbane Lions in recruiting. He spent 12 years with the Brisbane Lions from 1994 to 2005 and joined the Brisbane Bears as the club's Victorian office manager in 1994. So they were called the Brisbane Bears. Then, when he first started with them, he was the development officer and under-19s assistant coach at Carlton from 1988 to 1991 and a regional manager of the Western Jets in 1992-93 before joining Brisbane. He was credited in finding Brisbane Lions duo Daniel Bradshaw, number 56 draft pick in the 95 national draft, and the 2002 Brownlow medalist Simon Black, number 31 in the 1997 national draft, who's also been got into the Hall of Fame this week as well, both multiple premiership players for the Brisbane Lions. He had a role in recruiting with the Brisbane Lions with their triple premiership triumph era from 2001 to 2003. And in 2018, he was elevated to the general manager of list strategy and recruiting at the Sydney Swans. We welcome to the Heen View the Sydney Swans general manager of recruiting and list management, Kinnear Beatson. Welcome, Kinnear.
Hi, Mark. Thank you for the introduction. Hi, Stoney.
G'day, mate. How are you? Looking forward to this.
I'm well, thanks.
Well, I'm looking forward to it too. And I guess I want to get it started. Just on a quick front, Kinnear, you're actually with the Sydney Swans, but you're based in Melbourne and you're required to go up a couple of times a year. But you're based out of Melbourne, so that's your role?
Yes, yeah, it is, Mark. I mean, even when I was working with Brisbane, I was still based out of Melbourne, predominantly because so many of the recruits come from the southern states. There's well over 50% of each draft pool taken out of Victoria, so you'd be mad to be working interstate and doing all that extra travel just to watch players of a weekend.
Absolutely, and a lot of football gets played in Victoria. Just wanted to ask you, I have been watching some updates from the Sydney Swans and sort of getting an understanding of the staffing department. So during the week, John Longmire was on Footy Classified, and he mentioned he had to have a conversation with a former premiership player with the Sydney Swans in Ty Canali about maybe standing down within that role because of the situation that we're in. Can you give us a bit of an overview of not just the football department, but also recruiting when it comes to the hours that you're spent in that role during the current situation and the people that work with around you in recruiting as well?
Yeah, firstly, Mark, I mean, it's been a really brutal period since COVID-19 struck, and the implications for the club have been really tough. And the people within the club and the football department and right across from Tom Harley down, there's had to be a lot of very difficult decisions made, simply on the basis of what the soft cap looks like now, which has been adjusted accordingly, and also with the projections of what the income's going to be for the year. So in that space, it's ongoing, and it would have been a really, really difficult discussion for John and Charlie Gardner, our GM of footy, to have with both Tig and
Henry.
Stewie Maxfield, would have been really hard. Craig Holden, another life member, long-term servant of the club. So really difficult. But, you know, the Swans aren't the only club that's in that situation. I see today that North Melbourne today have let their AFLW coach go after his first year there in what was an outstanding season. So, yeah, it's tough. It's tough. In terms of what we're doing at the moment, to just go on, we're all stood down, as the majority of football are people in football are. I go back to work with one of my co-recruiters part-time next week for about 3 days a week, and then we'll both go full-time on the start of July. There's 2 other staff members work with us full-time. It's yet to be decided when they'll come back, and that will be determined by what games we've got to watch, what vision we've got to analyse, all those things yet we haven't got answers to.
Kinnear, I suppose, question about the frustrations, I suppose, with no football. Me being in the VFL space and the NAB League, how are you going as far as looking at recruit? I mean, I know you've had players in the past that come through 16s, 18s, but how are you looking at football moving forward for 2021 when there's no football at the moment as far as recruiting goes?
Yeah, the whole thing's been really difficult, and it hit so quickly, Mark. That was the thing. We were at the stage there that we were into the pre-season mode. The NAB League had started practice matches. I think they had about 1 or 2 weeks to go. So fortunately, we'd had a chance to watch some games there. The VFL was starting to get going. Of course, the AFL pre-season competition had finished. So we had some football that had started, but it ended so abruptly that it caught everybody off guard. Very fortunately for us, one of the people in our staff, Ross Monaghan, is our futures coordinator. And Ross specialises in looking at what the future drafts look like. So as when we go to the trade table and we're talking about potentially trading future picks out, we've got a better idea of where the strengths and weaknesses of the next 2 drafts look like. As difficult as that is, because as you can imagine, when you're trying to forecast 2 years out, the 16-year-olds can change quite dramatically. But you've got to have some insight into it. Again, fortunately for me, Ross has just got an enormous work ethic, and he'd produced a lot of vision databases on over about 200 odd players that would be likely to be considered in this year's draft. So since COVID-19 started, even though I was stood down, I've been watching about 3 players a day, and they can average from, say, 3 games of edits through to about 12 games of edits. By the time you finish watching them, you've got a really good feel for where the strengths and weaknesses of that player lies and what the drafts look like. So if that's all we've got, along with the testing data that we've got from years gone by, so be it. But there'll be enough information for us to make a call come draft day.
I guess one of the things about the scenario planning, not so much just with COVID-19, but when you come into a situation where, you know, a lot of your work, and particularly with your title, is done around, you know, the November draft and, you know, players, whether they've finished school and they'll get drafted, so on. When you go into a draft, which is like a pre-season draft, or you go into the next year, are there more scenarios for you that there's like so many tangibles in that role? Because you could have a certain player that you could go, right, we've got this pick in the draft, in November draft with the AFL draft, and then the next year it can turn on its head because maybe some players chosen a different sport. For instance, you know, there's the competition between cricket and football, if they're talented in both sports, or perhaps we're on the verge of a health pandemic crisis, or you have to cut your list down. So does a draft, whether it's a February or a draft that's perhaps a smaller draft before the season, does that create more scenarios, and because of the situation we're in as well?
Well, the landscape's changed a lot, Mark, since I started in recruiting back in the very early 90s. I mean, there's more avenues now to adjust your list. You've got the free agency period, you've got delisted free agents, you've got the SSP period, which is prior to the start of the year, and you've got the mid-season draft as well as the national draft and the pre-season draft and the rookie draft, as well as trying to find international rookies or alternate talent rookies. So there's a lot to be covered. The mid-season draft last year, which was the first time it had been introduced for a while, that was an interesting exercise in itself, because you had right up until that day to declare whether or not you were going to go into it. So you could have theoretically got an injury that was going to put a player out for the remainder of the year, either that weekend or at training on a Tuesday or the Thursday morning, and you'd be in the draft. So we had to plan as though we were going to be in the draft, not knowing whether we would be, because it would have been a disaster if we hadn't done the work and then suddenly there's an injury a week out and you don't know who the pool is. That would just be shocking. So that occupied a lot of time, possibly not for a lot of reward, but you've just got to be prepared to have all those bases covered.
The list size is obviously been conjecture about how many players on the list and players on contract and, what players, John comes to you and says, I suppose this is how it happens. He goes, I need a ruckman, or who actually makes that call? We need a ruckman, another midfielder. Is that a consultation between the coach and recruiting staff? And obviously you've got to turn over a certain amount of players into the year. I mean, even that now comes into the calculation and differently, because you don't know, how many players you're going to have to drop off and how many players you pick up, and you haven't seen any footy yet. So it's really a spider web, so to speak, at the moment.
Oh, it is, Mark. I mean, we had a list management meeting last week, and it'd be no secret that about 15, 20 minutes in, we all felt, well, we're putting the cart before the horse. We don't know what the salary cap's going to be. We don't know what list sizes are going to be. And all of those things are going to have a huge impact in terms of how you structure your list, apart from trying to see where you're at in terms of your football cycle, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Whether you're really having in the premiership window, or whether or not you're still sort of building and developing for it. Because there's so many unknowns at the moment, it's quite a frustrating period, and it's going to be frustrating for a while, because the AFL, from what I hear, have only just opened up discussions with the Players Association, and that could go on for ages yet. So for us, in terms of looking at what the list will be, it's, as you said, it's a bit of a spider's web, because we don't know. There's been some conjecture that it might be as low as 35, 38 or 40. What I'm hearing more lately is that it's going to be 40, and then in 2022, it will go to 35 and 6 top-ups. But this is all just conjecture, nothing confirmed by anybody, nothing really confirmed about the salary cap, and nothing confirmed about, well, what happens with existing contracts, etc.
Just a little one for me. Is it it's like, how life has stopped and then it's starting again. And, you've been footy a long time. And so you've seen footy from a whole different angles, and all of a sudden you have something which has rocked the world. I mean, it's a worldly type situation, never we see again, hopefully. And then you got this transition and change to another world. So it's like you've gone from here to here. There's not much in between. You've got to start thinking differently without knowing the whole picture. So it's something unique in it, as in any sport, or elite sport especially.
Absolutely. It's very fluid at the moment. Sort of as each day goes by, we're getting more and more information. It's trickling out though. And understandably, that the total focus for the AFL has been to get AFL back being played, to save the game, I would imagine, from a financial perspective. They had to get the game going. So all the energy has been spent on doing that. And that's been a very complicated process, as you can see, with each state government having different rulings and boundaries and borders shut and hubs, and it would be a nightmare to work through it. So the focus has been purely on that. But now that we're only, less than a week away from the first game, I'm anticipating that the other stuff about the draft, list sizes, etc., will start to take more of a priority with the key people in at the AFL. Just topping off on that, Mark, so as a result of that, we've just got to keep, as fluid as we can and thinking laterally and outside of the square and just adapting as we go.
Kinnear, I wanted to get your views a little bit on about where you were sort of 12 months ago or what you'd be doing in season within June. I mean, you were talking about stripping of budgets, and I'm not just talking football club budgets. I'm talking, recruiting budgets and your role, because you're based in Melbourne, but you also have to travel to Sydney for work and for the, maybe list strategy meetings and that sort of thing. Can you just take us into the scenario, what you would have faced this time, say in June last year or corresponding years, and what you're faced with now, and I suppose what a typical week would have looked at pre-COVID and now while you're in COVID, say around that June period?
Yeah, pre-COVID, the footy world, once you get going in recruiting and list management, is quite frenetic, to be honest with you. You could work 7 days a week quite comfortably, but we've decided from a mental health aspect, that's not a good thing to do. So the recruiting department, we have Mondays off, simply because no one else in the footy department really needs us on a Monday. They're too heavily involved in post-match reviews, injury reviews, etc., etc., etc. So we have that day. We try to freshen up on that day, play golf, do whatever you need to do, shopping, house, things around the house, whatever, and then we're back into it. In terms of my travel to Sydney, we have a monthly list management meeting, which coincides with the board meetings at the club. Andrew Ireland, who's on the board now, also is on the list management committee. It's great to have someone with his experience and knowledge involved in that. He's just a great sounding board for Charlie, John and Tom Harley and myself. But of course, now that COVID's happened, things like these Zoom settings and things like that have opened our eyes up to other opportunities that we can do. And I would imagine that a lot of our list management meetings will be held via Zoom sessions rather than the need for us to travel back and forth all the time, because that usually involves accommodation as well as travel. It's difficult if you've, say, got a 9 o'clock meeting in Sydney to go up in the morning. You only need delays with flights, fog, bad weather, traffic on the arterials, and you're in trouble. So we always go the night before. So COVID will mean we'll have to be a lot more stringent with our budgets, as all clubs will be, and that will be one of the consequences of it. But that's okay. We'll adapt. You move on. You don't know how you're going to adapt until you're confronted with the situation, and then you do. So that's okay. We're learning as we go.
Finding a recruit, Kinnear. Obviously, me myself love the game and love the recruiting game. And just for you, when you first started, there's a lot more science in it these days and a lot more digging. You can no longer get a needle in a haystack, can you, or can you?
Not really, Mark. I mean, occasionally someone will bob up out of the school system or the waffle or the sample that's a country kid that hasn't played much and has bobbed up late, but they're few and far between, to be honest with you. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're lucky if you can find, as we used to call, a smoky nowadays. The system's too refined. There's too much information, but that's good because it's saving clubs a lot of money, wasting money on talent that we didn't have the information that we needed to make more accurate decisions on. Things like GPS data, the amount of fitness testing results that we've got, the psych appraisals, the amount of vision that we've got to assess. It's all made it a hell of a lot different to what it was when I first started at Carlton, when the draft was in its early stages. Like you could drive down to Portland, all the way down there, and watch to one player, and he'd get a corky in the first 5 minutes, and then you're sitting there going, well, what am I doing here now? I got a long drive home again. Whereas it's streamlined now through the NAB League and the championships and that sort of stuff, that it's made that a lot easier, and you're able to compare X with Y, etc. through that.
That could happen in Tasmania, Kinnear, too. You could be on a flight to Tasmania, and the same thing could happen with a player that goes down with a knee or a hamstring, and then all of a sudden you think, what am I doing here?
Yeah, look, it can happen. Sometimes with school games, Mark, that happens. You might just want to check up on how a player plays in a different position when they're playing APS or AGS or the Catholic college system, and they get injured early or they got the flu. So there's a lot that goes into it, and yeah, that's frustrating when it happens. But tell me another job that doesn't come with its frustrations. I'm lucky. I'm lucky. I love my job and I'm very passionate about it. So,
well, that's always good to hear. You always want to hear someone that's really happy about their job. I want to ask about the Sydney marketplace in a lot of ways when it comes to recruiting, because I think it's probably more unique than any other interstate club, because there's an emphasis on getting the big fish, you know, whether it's been previously with a Tony Lockett, Lance Franklin. If you can let me know where you're at with Joe Danaher, that'd be great, but we don't expect to get that information. But I guess in some ways, when you're looking for those sort of big key players, how much does that have an impact on the overall pie of recruiting? Because within a club like Sydney, it is on a national scale with a marketplace. So you need a key name to lure up there to improve that sort of standing in the committee. And, you know, I suppose negligent of us not to ask about the importance of what the NRL's been doing in the last couple of weeks, and the competition getting up and running on May 28th through, you know, the great work of Peter V'landys, who's part of the NRL and the commission. So I guess what I'm saying is here, when you get a big recruit, whether it's a Lance Franklin or a Tony Lockett, do you feel do you have to look outside the square more than so other clubs, other interstate clubs where football, say in Adelaide or in other parts of Australia, is a little bit more common than Sydney?
There's probably two aspects to it, Mark, to the question you've asked. One is our board is very strong on the fact that we can't afford to go down to the bottom and rebuild. Sydney is a unique market, a bit like Brisbane in the weather, and there are a lot of other alternatives that people can do. And if the club isn't playing attractive, competitive footy, as we've seen with Brisbane and Sydney before, the crowds won't come. So we've got to work really hard to put a competitive team out there. The club doesn't, and this is from the board down, the club doesn't believe that you've got to go down the bottom and rebuild. We're in a marketplace where you can't afford to do that. Secondly, it is a unique market, Sydney, and for whatever reason, they love a big forward, whether that's Tony Lockett or the other madman with the long blonde hair. What's his name again? Sorry, before my time, with the
Warwick Kappa.
Yeah, Warwick Kappa, and now Bud. They just love them. They're drawn to them. And it's one of the frustrating parts when you hear people making commentary about, has the Franklin deal been a success? Well, I dread to think where the club would be financially if it wasn't for Buddy and the exposure that he gives our sponsors, QBE, Volkswagen, realestate.com, etc. He is massive and he draws people into the game. Where all clubs are in it to win premierships, and that's how you're measured. But we've made grand finals with him there, and you've got to be in the grand final to be able to win it. So it's too simplistic to say that it's been a failed recruiting coup because we haven't won a flag as yet with Bud there. They're just not aware of all the facts in what goes on in the Sydney market.
Kinnear, one last one for me. Has recruiting always been for you? Has it always been ever since you started way back at Carlton and you evolved through Brisbane, through Adelaide, through Sydney? Has it always been something that's been in your blood and evolved from that point?
I think it has been, Mark. I mean, prior to getting into footy, I was a phys ed teacher. And I played footy, but I was a very modest player. Had a tryout at Melbourne, but was nowhere near good enough. And then played in the Essendon District League and the Riddle District League and loved it. But my real passion was just seeing young talent being identified and then developed. And one of the more rewarding things I did was way back in 1988, I think it was. I coached the Victorian schoolboys with Anthony Koutafidis and Matthew Croft and Kent Butcher and some of these guys, Anthony Bannock down in Tassie. And I think that was the start of it for me. And then after that, I got into the under-19 scene at Carlton, was offered a full-time role there. And it was a big decision to go from the security of teaching into the world of AFL footy. But it's always been my passion, that part of it. And I've had opportunities to pursue GM of footy roles and stuff like that. And I've had good friends that have done that role. And to be honest with you, it's almost killed them, that role. It's a really, really tough role. And when push come to shove, I just thought, it's not for me.
That's fair enough. And we understand that, there's obviously decisions that have to be made throughout the course of a footy season, and particularly with, what you've done sort of even post-footy. One thing I want to leave you with today, Kinnear, I'm just going to get something from here. I'm actually counting down to June 40 because I'm an Essendon man. So I want to show my Essendon colours.
Yeah.
I've got my scarf and I'm already counting down, and I hope that you have a few injuries before then. No, only joking, but already counting down to June 14 because Bombers man, Bombers member, and Essendon and Sydney have played some great games across the years. Who would have thought the 96 preliminary final would have been decided by a point with Tony Locker kicking a point after the goal? But yeah, on a lighter note, how good is it obviously to have footy back? Is it great to have a little bit of banter when you know that it'll come back? And just tell us about something that you've been doing during the COVID-19 shutdown that you wouldn't have done. Have you done a lot of cleaning, a bit of jogging, or a bit of, work on the car, or what's something that you've done that you wouldn't have otherwise done?
Well, I'll share something with you, Mark, and this is unique. I actually ended up spending 3.5 days in hospital on the back of a cat bite from my cat that bit me on my right hand at the base of my index finger. The thing got that infected that not only did I have to go on intravenous drip for 3 days, but they actually had to debride the wound, open up the knuckle and flush out the knuckle. So that was probably one of the more unique things I've been. One single cat bite on the side of my finger.
Can you show us your hand? Is there some bandage on your hand?
Bit hard to... No, not now. It's over 3 weeks old now, but it's... Yeah, you can see... I don't know whether you can see it.
Yeah, I can pick that up.
Right on that knuckle. But unfortunately, cats have a lot of bacteria in their mouth, apparently, and you've got to be very careful with infection in the blood. And somehow he punctured the joint capsule on that knuckle, and it got into the knuckle, and oral antibiotics weren't strong enough to fix it. So I almost fainted when the doctor came in and said, not only are you on the intravenous drip, we've booked you in for surgery tomorrow. I actually said to the doctor, you sure you're in the right room, mate? I've got a cat bite. So that's held me up a bit. I haven't played any golf. I was doing some projects around the house, but that's pulled me up a little bit. But thank God it's good now and I'm back to normal.
And if you need to fly again, you won't be still going through the terminal. and also too, there's some great cat videos out there as well. So I'm in a town that I live in, and we live in a town where we're surrounded by Geelong cats, and they can't bottom out as well because they rely a lot on this town to see the success and the stadium at GMHBA. So you're going to be surrounded by cats at some stage.
Yeah, mate, it's an unrelenting business, but you wouldn't have it any other way. I mean, the rewards are really high. The lows can be low, but there's as Stoney knows and yourself, there's so many great people that you mix with in footy. And even in the early days of COVID-19, the phone calls between people from opposition clubs just checking on each other. How are you going? How's your position? I mean, there's countless and countless of terrific people in the football industry. And I feel blessed that I've been in it for so long. It's been great.
Well, we really appreciate your time for being on the Heen View podcast. We haven't really had an AFL perspective and a recruiting perspective, so we think it's fantastic that you've joined us on the program, and we really appreciate all your insights into all the knowledge that you have from a recruiting front, but from also a football department front and what goes into a club like Sydney, and also your experiences at previous clubs like the Western Jets, and obviously, you know, when you think of the Brisbane Lions triumph and what Simon Black went through this week to get the Hall of Fame, so it must give you a lot of enrichment. But thanks for joining us on the program.
No, my pleasure, guys. I've really enjoyed it. Good luck
Thanks,
with the podcast.
And Mark Stone, what a great guest, Kinnear Beatson from the Sydney Swans, and obviously he has an important role throughout this period, and then getting back to where football started. You know, the Sydney Swans are going to be playing very soon, and they've got a first home game coming up against Essendon.
Hasn't got the easiest job in the world, trying to construct a list and drop players off, pull players on. Recruiting is a bit of a science these days. It takes a lot of people, a lot of effort. And I know Kinnear's been in business a long time and respected. So it's been great having him on.
And you can get in contact at any time with the Heen View. We're on Facebook. We're also on Instagram as well. Our podcast is available through iTunes Podcast. The Heen View is on Spotify and Podbean. And Stoney, you've just got us onto the YouTube channel with the Heen View. We've got a library of videos already, and this is going to go up on episode 8. So congratulations for that. And we'll see you next time on the Heen View. Bye for now.